I'm here with the Jepson School, and I'm teaching a course this semester on participatory action research. And as we got into the semester, it occurred to me, wouldn't it be wonderful to invite Ernest Stringer, who is the author of one of the texts that we're using in the course. It occurred to me as an especially good idea because last semester in September I traveled to Australia for a world conference on participatory action research, expecting to meet one of Australia's most prominent people in action research, only to find out that he was in the States studying here. So when I got back, I found him at the University of New Mexico and learned that he has spent a good deal of time in the States, including getting his his DED, PhD in education at the University of Illinois. And he combined his study in education with a great deal of sociology and anthropology. He's also worked with Ivana Lincoln, who is very prominent in the field of action research, naturalistic inquiry, constructivist inquiry, in dealing with alternative paradigms in social research. And so some members of my participatory action class are here, and some former members of my participatory action class are here. And we'll recognize Ernest Stringer for his work. He is one of the most prominent people in the world in this field. His book on action research has gone through 2 editions, and he currently has a contract with Prentice Hall for 3 books on action research, relating it to individual professions. In addition to the work on methodology and teaching at Curtin University, he is affiliated with the Center for Aboriginal Studies. And he comes to the social sciences and social issues through a commitment for democratic equality in an especially trying circumstance in Australia, that is the relations of Europeans and European migrants and other migrants and Aboriginal people. And that's what we've asked him to talk about this afternoon, reconciliation. It was a theme in Australia last year, and it was very eye-opening to see a nation come to terms with racist policies of the past, things that in this country we have so much to learn about. So as we talked about a possible topic of conversation, he explained to me that he has worked also on issues of reconciliation of Hispanic groups, Native American groups, with the white dominant culture of the United States. Please help me welcome to the University of Richmond, Ernest Stringer.
Thanks, Dick. If I was home in an appropriate context, I'd say good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In other contexts, I'd say g'day, mate. And if I was in Texas and I was wanting to be heard, I'd say, listen up, y'all. So I come to you, I speak on this topic with a little hesitation, not being at all considering this within my area of expertise at all. So it will be an exploration for all of us to some extent. I do, however, speak with the permission and the authority of the head of the Centre for Aboriginal Studies, who's my boss, who's an Aboriginal woman, and who keeps me in line and chastises me when I go over the line. I've been an academic in my own local university, Curtin University, since 1976, following my work here at the University of Illinois. In 1984, 2 Aboriginal people asked me to assist them to start up a Centre for Aboriginal Studies at our university. And since that time I've worked in that Centre for Aboriginal Studies, which is a centre which is run by Aboriginal people, for Aboriginal people, and which only employs people like me who have no authority but have played some expertise. So you'll never see within the Centre for Aboriginal Studies my signature rather, on a piece of paper. I don't have the right. But what I need to do before I start is to find out why you're here and what you would like to hear from me, because I've only got a vague idea about why the notion of reconciliation might be interesting for some people from Richmond, Virginia, in the United States of America. So can anybody tell me what is it about this topic came up that interested you, or why you came along? Apart from the fact that some people came along because it's class time for them.
Well, we're part of your audience is in the Leading Groups course, and we are starting today a section on how leaders affect public problems. So this is obviously an issue in our country as well as yours, and you're interested in how the problem was addressed in the public sense.
The problem of?
Reconciliation and race relations generally.
Okay. Could I push that a little bit further?
Sure.
Okay.
There are lots of other folks.
Sure. I'll come back to you if I need to. Any other people wanting to?
I'm here from the law school, and I'm very interested to hear about the relationship between Aboriginal rights and reconciliation, thinking about legal structures here which tend to separate the notion of Native American rights and sovereignty and treaty rights and so forth from the issue of race discrimination in terms of statutory structures.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm from the chemistry department. I'm going to be going on a study tour in Australia.
Okay.
And when you look at issues of reconciliation on subjects like this, a lot of times it helps define in a way that less tense subjects might the national identity, help you understand how people view their identity with respect to other people.
Okay.
In terms of Richmond, race has been probably the number one point of division for us as long as anybody can remember. And it's something that a lot of people are struggling with, and how do you go about fixing this? So I think for some of us that's an issue. We're eager to find ways of creating reconciliation.
Okay. Reconciliation in the United States, I'll keep out the United States, but I'll come back to Virginia. Reconciliation between whom? The notion of reconciliation. Well, first of all, what does that mean, reconciliation? Anyone want to have a stab at that? No.
Coming to terms with the past and moving forward.
Okay. To reconcile the past with the present and the future, could we say it that way? Okay. I feel almost, when I'm speaking about this, like bringing up the subject of the Emperor's new clothes. Do you know that? So, nobody could tell the Emperor that he was naked. Okay. How can you tell the Emperor until a small child said the Emperor has no clothes? Touched on a subject that's not to be spoken about. And that's so in Australia for many years. As I think about reconciliation in America, what I'm looking at is the history of the United States of America, which in some respects mirrors the history of Australia with some important distinctions. A European nation coming into a country inhabited already by indigenous peoples and taking that nation and doing damaging things to the existing peoples. Okay, that both the US and Australia have that in their histories. So at this stage in Australia's history, there's a national recognition of the fact that we need to name it. That yes, we took the country, that yes, we did damaging things to the people, that what has resulted is terrible. We need to reconcile ourselves with a history and with the outcomes of that history at the present. So the US is in the same position in relation to its population in general and the Native American population as Australia is in relation to its Indigenous population. But I think when I look at that topic, I also think probably there's reconciliation between the American population at large and Hispanic peoples. If you look at the history of the region where I'm working now, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, California, that country was taken from Hispanic peoples historically, and the Hispanic peoples in that region are still, to some extent, suffering from the history of that process. And I don't know this at all, but I rather suspect from what I see and feel that the same is in respect to the history of African American peoples and the history of this country. We need to reconcile the history and what's come out of that history. How am I doing? Am I in the area? Give me a few nods. So look, just so that you know the context that I'm talking to, so that you can see whether or not when I'm looking at the US, when I'm thinking about the US, whether I'm off the planet altogether because my context and my situation is so different that I really can't understand what's happening here. So, how much do you know of Australia? Do you know how big it is? Approximately. It's that big. Okay. In physical size, it's approximately the same size as the continental US of A. So if I was to turn this map upside down, you know, you can get a rough approximation of the United States of America without Florida. But the size is approximately similar. Australia, however, has got a large desert in the middle. So the people inhabit the coastal fringes largely. So I have a pointer on there with my little pen, but I can just think of it. So that most of the population of Australia lives in the sector down here and in this corner here. The interior is very sparsely populated and there are a few pockets of population. The population of Australia is approximately the same as Texas, about 19 million people, in an area the size of the US. And just to give you an idea, there's 6 states in Australia and a territory that has not yet got statehood. And the size of the states is illustrated by this map. So we have Texas, Britain and Ireland, and Japan, all within the confines of my state. So when I say I work in West Australia, when I say that I get up in the morning to go to work on some projects that are at the other end of the state, you can see the distances that I'm travelling. So a very dispersed population. In terms of the Aboriginal people, and I'll speak a lot about the Aboriginal people because this is where the reconciliation process is directed in Australia. Aboriginal people are almost the reverse of European Australians or non-Aboriginal Australians, insofar as most of them live in rural and remote areas of Australia, whereas the majority of non-Aboriginal Australians live in the city. It's interesting that it's one of the most highly urbanised nations in the world. 85% of the population approximately lives in 6 of the cities. That gives you some idea about the spread of the population. I'll be talking a little bit more about Australia to some of the faculty who are going to travel there tomorrow. Sorry, I was talking tomorrow to the faculty who will be travelling there later this year. What else? I'm just wondering, what else do I need to tell you about Australia and its history in order for you to understand? 1788, the first colony from Britain came to Australia and settled down in a place called Sydney Cove, and then moved to Botany Bay. Just a few hundred soldiers and convicts. Australia, as far as European people are concerned, started as a colony. It started as a jail to get rid of the unwanted people of Britain. So the first inhabitants of Australia were largely prisoners, criminals. So that's the start of non-Aboriginal Australia. And Australia still, in its mind, thinks that its history started around about the end of the 18th century. And I discovered that about, over 30 years ago, when I was a young teacher. And I was assigned to teach in an Aboriginal community out in the desert. And I asked the class, or part of the class, because I had 3 grades in the one classroom, to read the social studies, chapter of the social studies text, and then to answer the questions at the end of the chapter. I went away, did some work with another class, through another grade, and came back a while later and was asked, and I asked them, okay, let's look at the questions, see who got the answers correct. And the first question was, who discovered Australia? And the answer was, which they told me very dutifully, Captain Cook, the English navigator, in 1760 something, I think. And I looked at that, and that was the first time I realised that history books don't always tell the truth. Because here I was, with a class of children who had been living in that country in terms of their family histories for at least 30,000 years. And the textbook said Australia was discovered in 1764. So history texts don't always tell the truth. That was a very significant experience for me, living out in a community with people who were very, very different from me, with a very different history, with a very, very, very different view of the world. And I discovered very quickly that the teaching that I did, the information that I gave, what I required the children to do, in no way reflected anything about their actual lives. It was a stunning experience for me. Aboriginal people in that part of Australia at that stage were still hunter-gatherer people. They literally slept on the ground, as they had done for tens of thousands of years, probably hundreds of thousands. They had leaf shelters to live in. They hunted with wooden implements. And I discovered that they were an incredibly rich culture. I loved working with the kids. I loved going down and talking to some of the Aboriginal people. I learnt so much. It was just a wonderful experience for me. The children would take me for a walk out in the bush, and it would be a natural science lesson. It was a natural science lesson taught by the children to their teacher. So as we walked through the bush, the Aboriginal children would tell me all about the trees and the bushes and the fruits and the berries that they could eat, the little lizards and the birds. They would tell me the roots of which trees you could pull up or dig up to get water. Remember, this is desert. So much, incredible amount of knowledge I learned. But I also became sensitive to the history of Aboriginal people in Australia at that stage. And the history of Aboriginal people in Australia is perhaps the history of Indigenous peoples the world over. In the time of European settlements in the last few hundred years. The reality of it, in fact, was that Aboriginal people were dispossessed of their land in Australia. Australia was settled originally under a British legal term called terra nullius, no people, or empty land, I think it was. So in terms of the British coming to settle Australia, they settled Australia on the legal basis that there were no people there, ignoring the fact that Aboriginal people surrounded them. And as time went by, as the British settlements expanded, Aboriginal people were pushed off their lands when they couldn't be pushed further out away from the cities. They were put on reserves, which they refer to these days as concentration camps. And all of the diseases from the white man's world decimated populations. In some parts of Australia, there were massacres of Aboriginal people, where the people themselves were killed off so that white people could come in and peacefully farm the country. So it was a brutal history of dispossession. By the beginning of this century, the government decided that Aboriginal people needed to be protected because of the ongoing exploitation of the people, and in some cases the killing of the people. So they set in my state, they did it state by state, they set up the 1910 Native Protection Act, known as the 1910 Act. And the 1910 Act gave government officials, the Native Welfare Department, the right to care for Aboriginal people. What that did, what it meant in fact, was that it stripped Aboriginal people of all of their rights. They effectively became wards of the state. So that if they earned any money, it had to go on an account. They couldn't get the money out of an account if they wanted to buy a dress. She'd have to go and ask the Native Welfare Department for permission to get money out of her account so she could buy a dress. And if you go into the Batty Library in West Australia, which holds all of the historical records, it's got records of all of these accounts of, please may, to the Director of Native Welfare in such and such a town, please may I withdraw so many pounds, shillings and pence, that's the old currency, in order to buy a dress. Signed, Joan Winch. And then there'd be another letter saying, hereby I have permission to withdraw money from your account. So those sorts of things were bad enough. Excuse me. But then came, as part of the policy, the protection of the children. And it was deemed that many Aboriginal people could not care for their children adequately, and so the children were taken, many of the children were taken from their families and put into what was called missions, set up by the church. And the missions became places where Aboriginal children were put and kept for many years until they reached 16 years of age, and then they were just sent out into the community to fend for themselves. They were often taken many hundreds of miles away from their homes, and they were told that they were orphans, and that they had no family. So they lost track of their families. In that way, what happened in many parts of Australia was that the Aboriginal family system, which was very, very close-knit and very nurturing, the extended Aboriginal family was a very nurturing environment, started to break down. And so today we still have families that are seeking to get back together to find the lost children, or children who have grown up seeking their parents or their brothers and sisters, and their uncles and aunts and so on. So the end of this process of colonisation of the country was that Aboriginal people fell into a slot in society where they lived on the fringes of the towns and cities, where they legally could not be in town after dark, where they had no voting rights, where they had to have permission to move from one town to another, where they had to have permission to have employment, the most demeaning conditions for peoples that you could imagine. I wish that I'd been able to bring a video which was made by one of my friends, in fact, in which he has people tell stories of these times. So in one case, there's a story being told by an old man of a time when the police and the welfare came to get his children, and he tried to stop them from taking his children, and he tried to hit the welfare man and hit the policeman, and the policeman, of course, clubbed him with his bat and handcuffed him and took him off to jail. And when he was let out of jail, he came back to where he was living, and his children were gone. And all he had left were footprints in the sand. So he got a piece of old tin and put a piece of tin over all that he had of his family, their footprints in the sand. So those things are bitter parts of the history of Australia. Now, because Aboriginal people are such a small minority, only about 1.5% of the population, they tend to be not seen. They live out of the cities largely, and when they live in the cities, they tend to live in the very poorest parts of the cities. The result of that history is that Aboriginal people are now an underclass of people in Australian society. It wasn't until 1967, just over 30 years ago, that they got the right to vote. Voting is compulsory in Australia for non-Aboriginal people, has been since 1901. In all state and federal elections, Aboriginal people did not have the right to vote until 1967. They were not given citizenship rights until that same year. If you look at all of the social statistics related to Aboriginal people, it looks like, and it is, a social disaster. You look at the health statistics, it looks like something out of the third world. I can't remember the terminology, the death rates of babies and the birth rate, the weights of babies as they progress, way down. You look at all of the illnesses and sicknesses, heart disease, stress diseases, and they're way up. You look at the education levels of Aboriginal children, and they're way down below the national norms. You look at housing, the houses are terribly overcrowded still, despite housing programs now that have lasted for a number of decades. So if you look at all of the social indicators, Aboriginal people now in the year 2001 are still desperately behind the rest of Australia in almost all situations. And how do you think Aboriginal people have responded to that history? Any idea?
Pretty negative, I suppose.
Very negative, in fact. So, white Australia has virtually said, look guys, since the 1970s, we've had lots of new programs and services, employment programs, education programs, housing programs, health programs, and things are great, aren't things wonderful? Look at the wonderful things that are happening for you. And Aboriginal people say, yes, but let's look at the statistics. Let's look at the children that are dying, look at the people that are dying. The average Aboriginal male dies at 50 years of age in Australia. That's 76 or 78 for non-Aboriginal Australia. So the social statistics are still terrible, but just as terrible is the dreadful relationships that exist between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. There is an awful lot of racism deeply embedded in the Australian culture. And that racism runs from people who just don't like Aboriginal people and who use negative terms. In certain parts of Australia, you'll hear Aboriginal people referred to as bungs, and that's equivalent to the N word in the US. Still very prevalent in certain parts of Australia. They're looked upon as being lazy by some people. Okay, it's lazy, degenerate, prone to crime, all of the stereotypes that you might think attached to a racist population. But then there's the institutional racism that occurs. And the institutional racism is much more powerful because it's so much more subtle. And the institutional racism comes out in ways that, for instance, judges, when they're sentencing Aboriginal people, you look at the sentencing, what's given as a sentence to non-Aboriginal people is given as a sentence for the same crime to an Aboriginal person, and there's just this disparity. And yet, in each case of the sentencing, you can say, well, the judge is acting within the letter of the law. He's not being particularly bad to Aboriginal people, but when you look at the statistics, what's happening in sentencing. When you look at the health statistics, if the same health statistics apply to any segment of the non-Aboriginal population to the white population, for instance, there'd be a national outcry, a tremendous pouring of resources into special programs to do something about it. Now, there are special programs for health, but the health statistics don't get better. So what's being done isn't working. And people say, oh yeah, okay, it's just Aboriginal people. So at an institutional level, people will put up with Aboriginal people what they wouldn't put up with in their, for other segments of the population. Am I painting a pretty picture for you? Is any of you aware of this, by the way? Some of you, okay. So, where does this put me? Okay, as a non-Aboriginal person working in the Centre for Aboriginal Studies, in a fairly invidious position sometimes. My colleagues and students know me. I've got a long history of working in that centre. I apply my expertise in a particular way, and I'm employed on a 3-year contract, effectively a 3-year contract, and that keeps being renewed by the people, the Aboriginal people in the Centre for Aboriginal Studies. But what that's done is to give me insights into the experience of Aboriginal people in Australia, how they experience being Aboriginal in Australia. And I must say, it makes me glad that I'm not Aboriginal. The privilege of me being white is a wonderful thing. When I look at what's happening to my Aboriginal colleagues, I attend too many funerals of relatively young people, people with whom I work around the state, young men and women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, suffering from stress diseases, heart attacks and so on. I attend funerals of too many children, my colleagues, who in various ways come into contact with the law or put themselves into situations of danger which results in their death. I experience on a fairly regular basis what I call just outright racism. And the way that I experience that is a sort of in a reverse sense, that myself and my Aboriginal colleagues, who are almost always my bosses, my organisational superior, will go to do work in a context. And we do work with a wide range of people, from bus drivers up through Supreme Court judges to senior officials in government departments to senior police officers and so on. And what we experience and what we learn to deal with, what I learned to deal with years ago, was that invariably the people we're dealing with assume that I'm the senior person because I'm white. And they will start talking to me and doing business with me. And so myself and my Aboriginal colleagues learned how to deal with that, and it's a body language thing. I drop my eyes, turn my body, I don't so speak, and eventually the person shifts their attention. It's very subtle, and when it first started happening, I started responding to the person who was talking to me, and I realised this is wrong. So the problem of Aboriginal people, or white Australia if you like, is that they haven't come to grips with the fact that Aboriginal people are still living amongst them, still suffering the effects of their history. There are some Australians, and probably a large and increasing number of Australians, who are now recognising and realising that something needs to be done about that. Something needs to be done to deal with that history. Has anyone got any questions on anything that I've said so far?
You was talking about the racism between, I can't exactly pronounce it, Aboriginal people?
No, it's non-Aboriginal people.
I know, but non-Aboriginal, I want to say if I'm saying it right.
Sorry?
Aboriginal, is that right?
Aboriginal.
Aboriginal?
Yeah.
Is there like a specific specific feature between the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal that they can distinct?
Oh, okay. In terms of their physical distinctiveness,
Right.
yeah, they're dark coloured people. I should have brought some pictures. I haven't got any pictures with me, in fact. But Aboriginal people are dark coloured people, and they're very distinctive physically, generally speaking. But there are Aboriginal people who, physically speaking, look very similar and are in fact undistinguishable from non-Aboriginal Australians, and they themselves have problems because they have been brought up in an Aboriginal community, they are part of an Aboriginal family, and yet they're not treated as Aboriginal, they're not identified as Aboriginal people. And they, some of my colleagues are in that situation, and they have a lot of difficulty in dealing with a form of reverse racism that denies them their Aboriginality. Did I answer your question? Any other questions?
You talked about some of the development programs that were in place in various contexts in terms of education and health and employment for Aboriginal people.
Yeah.
Are there any development programs in place to help educate, I guess, quote unquote, white Australians?
The interesting thing is that one of the things that those special programs did in Australia was to highlight the fact that there were also small pockets of non-Aboriginal people in situations of poverty who started to speak up and say, we're just as poor as Aboriginal people, why have they got special rights and we haven't? So that in fact the government started to look more broadly afield at the education of Australians generally, and so special programs got put into place, health welfare and so on for other poor peoples.
Look, I guess I meant more in terms of, are they helping to educate white Australians as to the rights of Aboriginal people?
Now that's coming into the territory of the reconciliation process. So I'll talk to that in a while. Okay. There's a sort of a yes and a no to that question. You had a question down there?
I wanted to know generally how the country deals with people who are, if you do have many people who are mixed with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, and how people accept them and which part of society they're accepted in.
In which, whether they're
Like
accepted
if-
as Aboriginal or not
Right,
Aboriginal.
right.
For mixed race people. It's very clear in Australia who's Aboriginal and who's not Aboriginal. And it's different from America. It's got nothing to do with the percentage of, what they used to call percentage of blood, quarter castes or half castes. We used to have half castes, quarter castes, 8 castes, 16th castes, and all the various mixing. So an Aboriginal person is such and such. But it became absolutely unworkable because a person who might have, in terms of that physical lineage, 3/4 European descent and 1/4 Aboriginal, but brought up in an Aboriginal community as part of the Aboriginal family, would be Aboriginal. He would be part of the family. He would learn to be Aboriginal. He would live as an Aboriginal, or she. And so the question now is that person Aboriginal is not how they look by how much percentage of Aboriginal heritage they have, descent, but who do they identify as being, and who are they identified as being. So the person themselves has to identify, I am Aboriginal, and they have to be accepted and identified as Aboriginal by the Aboriginal people themselves, the Aboriginal community to whom they are related. It has to work both ways. So in Australia, the notion of being Aboriginal is one of identity. And my Aboriginal colleagues and friends are very firm on knowing who they are. I am Aboriginal. And some of them have skins that are very dark, and some of them have skins and features that are not much different from mine, but they are very clearly Aboriginal in their own minds and according to the Aboriginal families with whom they live.
So they wouldn't consider themselves Australians? They would just...
They also consider themselves Australians. Yes, I am Aboriginal. I am Aboriginal Australian. And that goes for probably most of the Aboriginal people, except in the very remote areas of Australia. Just go back to my map there. In the very remote areas of Australia, in these parts here, there are still tribal groups that live a very traditional life. They live in houses to some extent, they drive around in vehicles, but they hunt. They still have their full ceremonial life, very rich cultural life, and they still have their own language. The older people especially mightn't necessarily speak English. And in some of those contexts, the notion that they're Australian is probably a very, very elusive and non-important event. They are Walpuri, or they are Ngayara, or they are Bunaba. They identify themselves according to their tribal name. But generally speaking, Aboriginal people say, yes, I am Aboriginal, but yes, I'm also Australian.
Andrew Young was here a few weeks ago, and he talked about how when the Olympics came to Atlanta, there was a big discussion about how the economic impact would or could benefit African Americans there in terms of development projects and things. And there's some study of what positive impact it did have on some African American communities and negative on others. And there was some coverage in the major press here about the discussion of Aboriginal rights with the Olympic Games. I just wonder if there was a real, genuine economic or cultural impact of the Olympics that will endure past the Olympic Games.
Okay, I think the Olympic Games signify to some extent what Australia's been trying to do, or some Australians have been trying to do in the last decade or so. Did anyone see the opening and closing ceremonies of the Olympic Games? There's a very large Aboriginal presence in those opening and closing ceremonies. And in fact, who lit the Olympic flame at the beginning of the Games? Kathy Freeman is an Aboriginal woman. It was a very, very significant, very symbolic event for Australia. And throughout the Games, in fact, in those opening ceremonies, there were both images of Aboriginal people and Aboriginal people themselves dancing and singing as part of the celebration of the opening and the closing of the Games. So that what's happening now is that Aboriginal people who have been historically consigned to the edges of the community and kept out of sight now are starting to come into public life in a much more visible way. So the invisible people in Australia have started to become visible. It probably brings me to the fact that for the last 10 years that the government has actually put in place a national reconciliation process. That national reconciliation process has actually been legislated. Does it solve all the problems? No. Does it make things right? No. It's a beginning, and it's an official and a legal recognition of the history of Aboriginal people in Australia. In 1993, there was an actual court decision, which is known locally as the Mabo decision. The first time in their history, Aboriginal people were recognised as having been in Australia prior to European people coming. That's in 1993. So now we have a whole legal process that is moving very, very slowly, but through the very difficult issues that Aboriginal people have rights to the country. How do we negotiate this? Do Aboriginal people move in and take over Sydney? Do they take over Melbourne? Do they take over Adelaide? Do they take over the farms? Do they take over the pastoral properties, the ranches, in American terms? This is in the back of some people's mind, and that's not what native title is about, but it's an issue. You've got a question?
Can you repeat the act you said it was?
It's called the Native Title Act. And this is a result of a legal decision in 1993 by the Australian High Court, which recognised legally for the first time that Aboriginal people had lived in Australia prior to white settlement, and that they therefore had rights to the land. Now there's a big ongoing legal event, I can only call it an event, that's happening as a result of that. Which lands can which Aboriginal people have a right to? And so there are a whole range of cases throughout Australia where Aboriginal people are claiming back their own land. And the people who are on that land are having to deal with the fact that the land that they assumed was theirs to use is now maybe not theirs to use as they wanted. They need the permission of the Aboriginal people whose land it is, or was, to use that land.
What prompted the court case and the legal proceedings?
The court case was prompted by a man called Eddie Mabo. For many years there have been a series of cases where Aboriginal people have tried to establish, hey, I was here. My family was here before. And for many years, those cases got thrown out of court for reasons I don't know. Eventually, they started off from the lower court system. The Eddie Mabo case established a case for, I have been on this country, my family has been on this country for many, many generations. It is my heritage, it's my right. and it went through the lower courts and eventually went through and was passed by the upper courts as yes. And it overthrew, in fact, the whole legal system on which the settlement of Australia was based. So it was a very momentous event. But prior to that event, in fact, the Australian government had recognised the need to come to grips, to acknowledge its history. And many people in Australia who recognise the history, who recognise the damage done to Aboriginal Australia by that history and the need to do something about it. As I mentioned, there have been for a number of decades now social programs that try to do stuff about education, health, employment, and those very important things. They've had some effect, but the underlying problem still remains is the alienation between Aboriginal Australia and non-Aboriginal Australia. That Aboriginal people feel very, very antagonistic about the fact that racism still exists in Australia, that they still are subject to many of the negative outcomes of their history. They feel the need to find ways to work through that. But one of the things that needs to happen is for the nation to come to set up a process whereby that happens. And so in 1991, the Federal Parliament, Federal Australian Parliament, actually passed legislation to set up a Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation. Okay, now in this country it would be something like the Council for Native American Reconciliation, or the Council for Hispanic Reconciliation, or the Council for African American Reconciliation. And the council was comprised of prominent, eminent Aboriginal Australians and prominent, eminent non-Aboriginal Australians working as a council to work through what needed to happen for reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. So I'll just read you a little bit. It's from the preamble to the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation Act of 1991. The Parliament directs the Council to undertake a range of functions, including to consult with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and the wider Australian community on whether reconciliation would be advanced by a formal document or documents of reconciliation. After extensive consultation, the Council has decided that such documents would help the process, but that any such documents would have to A, express the Australian people's hopes and aspirations for reconciliation, B, share responsibility for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for making progress to overcome disadvantage through negotiated actions, C, recognise that much remains to be done, and D, outline an ongoing process which enables Australians to work together towards a reconciled nation. I think that final one is probably the one that's had most bite in it. An ongoing process which enables Australians to work together towards a reconciled nation, where the antagonisms that have existed for decades, centuries now, between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people are reconciled. There's a number of things that are wrong with that legislation, so that the movement the government put in place a number of things in immediate terms. One was they set up a national holiday. Sorry, it wasn't a national holiday, it was a national day. It's called National Reconciliation Day, in which there are ceremonies throughout the country recognising the place of Aboriginal people in Australia and the need for reconciliation. So that our university, for instance, is one of many places throughout the country where they have a ceremony in which the Vice-Chancellor of the university and other dignitaries with senior members of the Aboriginal community who are associated with our university, have a flag raising, they have speeches, they look at the things that the university is doing to push the process of reconciliation forward. That's sort of one thing. National Reconciliation Day, by the way, is called informally Sorry Day. And so that's one of the processes of reconciliation, is that non-Aboriginal Australians say we recognise the damage that has been done to Aboriginal people through our history, our involvement in their history, and we are sorry. We apologise. That is said. So that sorry day, that apology comes in a number of different forms. It has politicians, government, senior government people like state premiers, same as governors, I think, in the US. State premiers and senior politicians, senior government members, giving speeches indicating and recognising the damage done to Aboriginal people, the position in which they find themselves, apologising on behalf of the state or the nation for that fact, and looking towards ways in which reconciliation can take place. Somebody had a question?
Yeah, I'm actually a little confused on this Sorry Day issue, because a couple of months ago there was an article in the Washington Post about the child stealing. And prominent in the article was the refusal of the Prime Minister to apologize for it, to admit that it was any wrongdoing. And if the head of your government refuses to say that they're sorry, what effect does that have on how Aboriginal people receive the sincerity of sorries?
The Reconciliation Act was put into place by a Labor government in 1991. The Labor government is equivalent probably to the Democrats here. In the next election, in I think it was 1994, the Liberal Party, which is really the Conservative Party, if you can get your mind around that, came into power. And although they kept the reconciliation process and were true to the letters of the law as it was enacted in the legislation, and continued to support the reconciliation process, the Prime Minister, because of political pressures coming from country regions which are ultra-conservative and quite racist, refused to give a national apology. And at every public event where he's spoken, where there are Aboriginal people present these days, what happens as soon as he starts to speak is that the Aboriginal people stand up and turn their back on him. It's a very powerful statement. So in a recent event, in fact, that happened a few months ago, the Prime Minister was once again asked and challenged, will you as Prime Minister provide an apology to the Aboriginal people of Australia? And he said it's not appropriate. And within days, 500,000 people marched across Sydney Harbour Bridge to celebrate Reconciliation Day. So what's happening is that there is, in fact, a swell of support in the Australian community for the notion of reconciliation. Some of the politicians can't bring themselves to light on it because of the fact that there is still embedded racism in the Australian community with a lot of votes. So that's how it.
Well, is there the possibility, I mean, do they fear that they'll be asked to give reparations? I mean, is there a monetary thing behind this?
Absolutely. They also fear that they'll be asked for reparations.
Dr. Stringer, I'm going to have to take part
Sure.
of your audience.
Okay.
The leading groups class. But thank you so much. You gave us a great intro
Okay.
today in our work. I apologize, but we
What-
only meet once a week, so. we've got-
What I'll do is to give you, where'd that put it? I was about to launch into the fact that there is also a community-based reconciliation. It's not just government government program as such, but there is a community-based reconciliation process. And I will speak to that in a few minutes. I'll give you the notes for that when I find them. Okay, I'll leave them with you.
Sorry.